Howdy everybody. So I got sick last May, and spending a week as a bedridden Mucinex commercial led to me revisiting 2004's The Incredibles, a movie that I remember being fairly obsessed with as a kid before going 20 years without revisiting. And you wanna know what I realized? Other than the fact that extra strength Tylenol is decidedly not extra strength enough. This movie rocks.
It is time for their secret identity to become their only identity.
Well, I think you need to be more flexible.
You will show him you remember that he is Mr. Incredible, and you will remind him who you are.
We're superheroes. What can happen?
Does this mean we can come out of hiding?
And not even in the, oh yeah, it's pretty good for kids kind of way either. It's a straight up good movie. Alright, so I'm sure that didn't come as a shock to many people watching this, but allow me to explain myself. I've never been that much of a Disney person. There are a number of Disney projects that I adore, mind you, but I've always been more critical of the House of Mouse than I've been adoring. And for good reason, I think. The company has done a lot of pretty shady stuff over the years, such as spending heaps upon heaps of money to more or less break US copyright law, engaging in what are almost definitely monopolistic practices by buying up companies like 20th Century Fox, Lucasfilm, and Marvel, and leaning into a culture of sequels and IP reliance that I personally find exhausting. Heck, in the time since I rewatched this movie, Disney's CEO Bob Iger even said the quiet part out loud when he stated that Pixar is going to be leaning on sequels in the near future. A lot of that stuff left a sour taste in my mouth, and coupled with any number of the other things the company has done lately, like that Star Wars hotel that Jenny Nicholson did a video on, or discontinuing physical media in Australia, discouraged me from wanting to engage with the brand. Well, that, and I spent my college years working at a Toys R Us, a place where I was subjected to listening to Disney music, as well as children screaming the lyrics to Disney music for 7 to 10 hours at a time. Like, words can't describe what several years of that'll do to you. So, yeah, if I still have a couple of pictures of myself from back then, I'll be sure to throw them on screen right now to illustrate my point. The risk of sounding overly dramatic, I swear to God, that was my Vietnam. Anyway, that's all to say that I was pleasantly surprised when I sat down to revisit The Incredibles. Because not only was it the funny, action-packed family movie I remembered from my childhood, it was also an emotionally effective, clever story about identity too. But then again, it was also written and directed by Brad Bird. What do you expect from the guy who gave us the Iron Giant? So today, I thought I'd gush about The Incredibles for a bit and how it spins a fascinating yarn about identity. Before I do though, I'd love to try something new on this channel that went over pretty well on a previous one I had and ask a quick question of the day. What's your favorite Disney or Pixar movie and why? Feel free to drop an answer to that at some point while you're watching the video over in the comments. Additionally, if you're into movie podcasts, feel free to check out my two shows, Media Obscura and Glaring Admissions. They're available on the same RSS feed, which is linked in the description, and they also get full video episodes right here on this channel. Alright, so movie time. The Incredibles tells the story of a depressed former superhero named Bob Parr as he goes up against a villain named Syndrome. Syndrome was once just a plucky would-be sidekick for Bob, who was once known as Mr. Incredible. He's spent the past decade and a half fostering a vendetta against superheroes after getting rejected by his idol and contributing to the mass expulsion of superheroes from public service. Over the course of the story, Bob learns that Syndrome has been killing retired supers left and right, and that he's planning on using the data he collected from doing this to build a powerful machine that only he can destroy. To stop him, Bob has to team up with his wife Helen, the former superhero Elastigirl, and their kids Dash and Violet to find a way to beat Syndrome, stop his ultimate Omnidroid, and show the world that there's still a place for superheroes in society. Anyway, that was basically the movie I thought I was about to rewatch while I was sick. A pretty straightforward vehicle to tell a couple jokes, feature some clever action set pieces, including a scramble for a controller that Bird would rely on again in 2011's Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, might I add, and make a pit stop to visit everyone's favorite character, Edna Mode.
My God, you've gotten fat. Come in, come.
And while the movie delivered on each of those things on such a high level that it already would have been an especially memorable movie had they stopped there, The Incredibles didn't. It also delivered an awesome blend of futurist and Art Deco style, a nostalgic but not necessarily rose-tinted look at the past, and themes that make the film ripe for revisiting as an adult, if not just a better movie when you do. Take our protagonist, for instance. In my last video, which was about Taxi Driver, Fight Club, and the culture of red flag movies that they embody, I talked about how powerless many people feel in their day-to-day lives, and how it can lead to them relating to characters that are problematic and may serve as an introduction to some, let's just say, questionable rabbit holes. I also talked about how many people tend to misread these movies because of how they're constructed, as well as because of stuff like their ambiguous endings. But despite touching on some similar subject matter, that isn't really a problem in the case of The Incredibles. Much like the protagonist from Fight Club, Bob is a disenfranchised husk of himself while he's working his soul-crushing white-collar job. They both drift aimlessly through life and struggle to focus because they feel like something fundamental to their existence is missing. Coincidentally, they also find release and meaning in their lives through technically illegal acts of violence, albeit very different forms of it that are both predicated on a lie. Bob has to lie to his wife about where he's going so that he can be a vigilante or superhero, and the protagonist of Fight Club has to lie to himself and imagine that Tyler Durden is a different person than him. Oh, and Bob is also literally named Bob too. You know, like Bob from Fight Club Bob, that's played by Meatloaf Bob. The one who deals with feelings of emasculation that aren't entirely unlike what Bob experiences in this movie, Bob. But whereas Fight Club is a movie about a mentally unwell person's illness getting to run amok due to an indifferent world and nobody picking up on the multitude of red flags that led to his identity crisis, The Incredibles is about the opposite of that. It's about a guy who knows who he is, knows what his calling in life is, and technically is getting helped by the world, but isn't allowed to be happy. The emotional dilemma of The Incredibles isn't that Bob doesn't know what kind of person he is, it's that the world doesn't want him to identify as that guy anymore. Because the government forced superheroes into exile, or as the movie itself put it,
For their secret identity to become their only identity.
Bob and many of his peers are actively getting discouraged from being themselves. The government has told them that the characteristics that make them unique are no longer wanted, and that they need to conform to more stereotypical positions in society like breadwinning husband, stay-at-home mom, or cool black best friend that's played by Samuel L. Jackson.
Ha! Never heard that one before.
Their true selves have been pushed to the sidelines, and anyone who isn't willing to go along with the superhero relocation program is basically implied to be an enemy of the state. To the point where some of the phrases on the newspaper that's on screen right now even recycles language from McCarthyism-era America. It's almost as if the society these characters loved enough to protect threw their hands in the air, thanked them for their service, then told them that they never wanted to see them again, to the point where the government banned them from existing. Which is especially ugly when you think about how that happened in the 40s and how the real world was experiencing some very similar things like... Look, honestly, you could just take your pick of any number of things that happened that decade because, yeah, there's a lot of it. For example, you could compare this to stuff like the Holocaust, Japanese internment, the beginnings of the Second Red Scare, Jim Crow, and if you want to go back to the 30s, even stuff like Stalin's Great Purge. It definitely feels ugly and uncomfortable to make these comparisons because this is a movie about superheroes, but yeah, this stuff also happened in the 40s, so it's kind of unfortunately easy to make that comparison. And what's interesting about this movie is that it isn't even about them trying to change that. Like, there's never a moment where these characters come together for a Captain America Civil War conference room scene and say, look, we've seriously got to do something about this whole relocation thing. What if something bad happens and we're not allowed to stop it, Tony? It's never even entertained as an idea in the first place because the characters were that shattered by what happened to them.
You remember Gazerbee?
Yeah, there was something about him in the paper.
He had trouble adjusting to civilian life, too.
When's the last time you saw him?
I don't see anyone from the old days, Bob. Just you.
My favorite of the many themes explored in this movie center around self-confidence and how, in order to have it, you need to come to terms with who you truly are. In fact, one of the movie's most memed moments stood out to me as a great character beat because of how it ties into this. It's the clip when Elastigirl is sneaking around Syndrome's lair and catches a look at herself in a mirror. Sure, it's been the subject of a bunch of way too horny posts online over the years, but it actually means something within the context of the movie. Up to that point of the story, Helen almost seemed to be ashamed of her old superhero days, as implied by the way she tries to handle Dash repeating something his dad told him once.
But Dad always said our powers were nothing to be ashamed of. Our powers made us special.
Everyone's special, Dash.
Which is another way of saying no one is.
She had grown past them and put that stuff behind her to start a family with Bob.
Uprooting our family again so you can relive the glory days is a very bad thing.
Reliving the glory days is better than acting like they didn't happen.
Yes, they happened. But this, our family, is what's happening now, Bob.
But now, forced to rescue him and on her own for the first time in a decade and a half, she's back in the action, and that forces her to compare herself to the person she used to be. At this particular moment, you have to remember that she didn't want to be there, nor did she want to put on a superhero costume or for her husband to run off and seemingly have an affair. And the way she sighs as she looks at herself and the way she's changed over the years, while being forced to interact with a version of herself that she no longer relates to, speaks volumes to how she feels about it. It communicates to us that for all of her literal flexibility, which doesn't seem to have missed a beat after all these years, she's still been affected by the superhero ban. But since she's here, she's able to process what she's been missing out on and hopefully incorporate it into her life in a more meaningful way.
Put these on. Your identity is your most valuable possession. And if anything goes wrong, use your powers.
But you said never to
I know what I said!
Similarly, Bob's entire glow-up sequence following his first fight with Syndrome's robot shows him regaining some of his youthful charm once he's allowed to interact with his true identity. He goes from depressed and overweight to well-defined and suave again. He even gets a new costume that visually communicates that this is a new chapter in his life and that it isn't an extension of his nostalgia for the glory days too. By getting to be Mr. Incredible, he grows as a person and ultimately allows for his family to grow too. Contrasted against the way Bob and Helen were acting earlier in the movie, it's a night and day difference. The two of them had a typical dysfunctional marriage before they reconnected with themselves, and after it are engaged with their kids' lives and happy together. The Parr children also continue the basic arc that their parents go through. Violet goes from being shy/closed off to confident and friendly. Meanwhile, Dash goes from being a nuisance and showboat to being a well-behaved athlete that knows how to check his ego at the door. And this only happens to them because they were given a space to express the traits that make them unique. Sure, that meant getting tossed into the jungle and forced to fight for their lives against people who are literally trying to kill them, but it also meant getting to look at their powers as gifts and extensions for who they are, as opposed to burdens that need to be hidden from the world. Which reminds me, a really cool part of The Incredibles is how all of their powers correspond to who they are. Starting with the kids, Dash has super speed because he's interested in sports and constantly wants to be seen by those around him. His desire for attention, his rebelliousness, and his competitive personality are textbook middle child syndrome, and they're amplified by his ability to outrun anyone in his path. Violet has the power to turn invisible and can create psychic barriers with her mind. It's the perfect complement to her closed-off, reserved, and deeply introverted personality. Bob has the always classic super strength, and it corresponds with his desire to see himself as the big, powerful breadwinner of the family. He spends a large chunk of the movie feeling emasculated by his inability to use his gifts for good, and that makes him feel weak. Helen has the power of elasticity, which gets reflected in how she seems to be the most well-adjusted member of the Parr family when it comes to not being a superhero. Not to mention, one can argue that her immense patience with Bob is an extension of how flexible she is. Despite constantly forcing them to relocate due to his inability to let go of being Mr. Incredible, she's always stayed by his side. And last, we have Lucius, whose days as Frozone have literally made him the coolest character in the movie.
Ha! Never heard that one before.
See? I was totally going somewhere with my earlier comment about him being cool. That totally wasn't just a weak setup for a joke or anything. Anyway, this leads to a real chicken or egg situation because it draws a line between their civilian and super identities. It makes you wonder whether their civilian personalities would have been different if they had different powers. But the thing is, it also doesn't matter because they don't. The characters are the way they are because their powers are their identities. And when you suddenly tell them that they can't use their powers anymore and that you want them to just be watered down versions of themselves without them, you obviously get a depressed Bob and a dysfunctional marriage between him and Helen. Because in the same way that real people are an amalgam of their roots and they're born with nature, these characters are informed by their powers and their relationship with them. And speaking of which, that got me thinking about how The Incredibles' thoughts on identity can be tied back to the real world. Early into the story, the movie introduced us to the Superhero Relocation Program. It's a piece of legislation that bans superheroes from active service, and in exchange for their cooperation, promises that their secret identities won't get leaked and that they'll be given new lives. And I couldn't help but feel like there was something vaguely don't ask, don't tell about the whole thing due to how the government agreed to leave guys like Bob alone if they quietly retire from superheroing. If you're unfamiliar with it, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the US military's way of handling what was then called LGB military personnel. It was in effect from 1993 to 2011, and as the title implies, encouraged non-straight service members to keep their yaps shut about their sexual preferences. If they didn't, they were discharged from service.
I cannot escape being troubled by the fact that we have in place a policy which forces young men and women to lie about who they are in order to defend their fellow citizens.
So yeah, it's kinda similar to the Superhero Relocation Program in that it's designed to instigate control over a group of people that aren't seen as the default due to something that wasn't their choosing. This comparison is helped by the fact that the film also shows that superheroes, or at least Bob and Helen, already have ties to the government and military. Bob has a handler that I personally think looks like Tommy Lee Jones in Men in Black that he knew well enough to invite to his wedding. And Helen's implied to have had some kind of military training before based off the way that she can fly a plane and use correct military pilot protocol on the radio while she's at it too. Additionally, the SRP forces superheroes to strictly adopt their secret identities, which can be compared to forcing gay service members to stay in the closet. I know that things may not line up perfectly, but seeing as so much of this movie has to do with characters rediscovering their identities as supers and the long-running and vague inherent flamboyance of stuff like superhero costumes in the first place, I think it kinda works. Plus, it isn't like this movie wasn't without some obvious references to gay culture, namely Edna Mode, who's obviously modeled after Andy Warhol. It's not that I think The Incredibles is secretly woke gay propaganda or whatever some chud with an auto-flag comment will claim I'm saying it is, it's that the movie can be read as something that gay or trans people might be able to relate to. The story is laced with thematic threads of finding yourself and not trying to hide yourself from the world that speaks volumes to groups facing oppression. You know, like gay or trans people who openly get mocked or ridiculed for something that wasn't even their oppressor's business in the first place. Not to mention, you could just as easily apply a lot of this movie's ideas on identity to things other than sexual orientation or gender. For example, you could also use it to explore racial or ethnic identity too, especially since this movie takes place a few years before the civil rights movement picked up steam in the US, and because of how the idea of casting your culture aside to fit in with everyday American society is a thing that many immigrants have had to deal with over the course of our nation's history.
Okay, what is this white people lunch? What is the store so excited about?
This is where Lunchables live, Mom.
Like, yeah, you totally can see the US government asking superheroes to stop fighting crime as a form of forced cultural assimilation. They're asking a group of people who place a premium on the traits that make them special to stop doing that, and as many immigrants can attest to, giving up parts of their culture in order to be more American can absolutely mess with how they perceive themselves. And it's not like any of this should really come as a surprise to folks, because some of this was what inspired famous comics like the X-Men. Hell, even Superman, you know, the most iconic superhero of all time, is the literal embodiment of an immigrant story, and the common thread of him trying to balance his Kryptonian and human heritage fits in nicely with everything I've been talking about.
If you intend to live your life with a mortal, you must live as a mortal. You must become one of them.
You know that thing people always say? That representation is important or whatever? It's that. It's literally that. I know people use that line a lot and that a lot of us are sick of hearing it, but it's only said that often because it's true and because a lot of folks really struggle to understand it. Speaking from experience, I can confidently say that it's important to see positive depictions of people who look like you in media. And it's also important for other people to see those kinds of depictions too, as one of the best solutions for bigotry is good old-fashioned exposure. As a half Middle Eastern guy with a very regional last name who grew up a spittin' distance from Manhattan in post 9/11 America no less, getting likened to being a terrorist by people you thought were your friends and feeling like you need to overcompensate on how American you are, at the cost of your own heritage by the way, can seriously fuck you up. Tangentially, because I'm sure someone's already glanced at my channel name and wants to be a snarky little somebody in the comments because that's all we ever do these days, no, that isn't my real last name, you curious George you. If you're looking for some related reading on the subject, I highly recommend Sam Louie's 2014 Psychology Today article, Elliot Rodger's Asian Self-Hatred as a Jumping Off Point. It's an article about Elliot Rodger, a mass murderer that was responsible for the Isla Vista killings and had a well-documented case of anti-Asian feelings despite himself being half Asian. I'm not defending the guy's actions because, like, holy fuck, why would I do such a thing? He killed 14 people, but Louis uses him as a clear example as to why it's important for people to have a healthy relationship with their heritage and culture. He says, "This is why race matters. Because we as Asian Americans hurt knowing he was never able to get to the second phase of the minority identity development known as the encounter stage, where an ethnic minority learns to see himself as valuable, loved, and cherished, not in spite of his culture, but because of it. In other words, minorities in this stage learn to embrace their heritage despite the surroundings that may convey contrary messages. And this isn't the only example one can cite on the matter either. 2023's American Fiction was an exploration of similar themes of self-hatred towards Black culture, and that movie was even a Best Picture contender."
I did notice that, well done, but I still can't send this out.
You said you wanted black stuff. What's blacker than that? It's got deadbeat dads, rappers, crack, and he gets killed by a cop in the end. I mean, that's black, right?
I see what you're doing.
Good, because it's not subtle.
Sure, both of those examples are a lot more complicated than what's depicted in The Incredibles, what with Elliot Rodger being a mass murderer and American Fiction depicting something that's closer to an inverse version of what's presented in The Incredibles, but they still share a similar through line. They're illustrations of what happens when people don't see or interact with positive depictions of their culture. Elliot Rodger's inability to relate to his Asian heritage was, among many other things, a part of what drove him to kill people. And Monk from American Fiction struggles to relate to what he sees as pop culture's standard depiction of Black culture because he feels that it doesn't fully embody what it means to be Black.
You know, nobody reads Bukowski thinking his is the definitive white experience, but white people read your book and confine us to it. They think that we're all like that.
Then it sounds like your issue is with white people, Monk, not me.
Well, maybe, but I also think that I see the unrealized potential of Black people in this country.
Back in the world of The Incredibles, though, there's also something to be said about the way the movie depicts the everyday, homogenized life that these characters have been forced to lead. Namely, how much it sucks. There are a ton of muted, drab colors everywhere, and a lot of the locations our characters inhabit are designed to be identical spaces that lack any defining characteristics. Hell, Bob is literally too big for this life. He works out of a cramped office, he drives a generic car he can barely fit inside, and he lives in the suburbs where every house looks more or less the same. For God's sake, the guy's name is Par. You know, like the phrase par for the course in golf.
Nice par!
His inability to be content being a normal guy is underlined by how ironic that is. It'd be like if Superman didn't like being Clark Kent and his name was Clark Super Normal Mild Manner Reporter Man and nothing else. Even characters like Dash's teacher fit the bill of being somewhat cookie cutter. I mean, look at this guy. Doesn't he feel like some nondescript person that worked at a school you once attended? The more I look at the world of The Incredibles, the more I think to myself how dull it is without the superheroes. I say this as a person who genuinely loves 50s and 60s chic, but everything's trapped in a state of mid-century genericness. It's not that the way things look is bad or anything, it's that the environments that have any level of pizzazz to them have something to do with superheroes. Even most of the character designs for anyone that isn't a super or has anything to do with them sort of falls into variations of one of several different character models. Which, yeah, is mostly because they aren't important characters and don't necessitate well-defined designs, but that doesn't really detract from my point. If anything, it only underlines how much it sucks for people to deny their identities. Because without them, everyone just becomes a cog in some greater machine. Now, there's obviously going to be the odd exception to this, of course. For example, Bob's boss has a very well-defined personality and a unique look, but he also exists as an inverse to Bob. He's the antithesis of everything our main protagonist is. Whereas Bob is large and should command attention in just about any room he's in, Mr. Huff is small and does command that respect and attention. Whereas Bob is meek and defeated, Huff is arrogant and proud. Bob has a strong sense of morality, and Huff doesn't. He's the embodiment of everything wrong with the world Bob lives in, and reflects how broken society is for relinquishing the supers and allowing these guys to run the insurance companies that are likely to thrive in their absence. Mr. Huff and his insurance company could be read as representing the idea that some greater force is oppressing people who just want to be happy and help you, while simultaneously telling you that they're the ones who want to help. Guys like him are the reason the system is broken. Oh, and he's also literally broken too. Speaking of the relinquishing of superheroes, it's also worth noting how this information was parlayed to us since it hints at the importance of identity. The opening sequence of the movie plays out in a mix of interviews with several heroes, a peek at the day Bob and Helen got married, and a newsreel that explains the introduction of the superhero relocation program. It basically sets the movie up with a triplet of perspectives. The interview footage, which is presented in faded color film, depicts the heroes showing off their personas more than anything, with them hamming things up and playing a role. It's a romantic glance at the good old days that isn't entirely accurate, but is at least rooted in reality. The next segment pulls the curtains back to show us that they're normal people who just so happen to have superpowers. It isn't shown to be a scan of any type of film, and as such is an actual depiction of reality as these characters remember it. And the newsreel quickly exposition dumps that the good old days were never meant to last, and does so with a very biased slant too, for that matter. If you pay attention, you'll notice how it completely gleams over how helpful the heroes were to society. The person we saw Mr. Incredible stop from killing himself is portrayed as a victim of being saved, a statement the newsreel gleefully allows us to hear before blowing past it without any level of nuance. Additionally, the newsreel jumps from saying that superheroes are hurting people to stating that they need to be banned, without acknowledging the fact that superheroes were providing a public service or that they were usually minimizing the damage done by other people. The newsreel just scapegoats them the same way that, say, LGBTQ+ people or immigrants get scapegoated for things like disease and crime. But more importantly, that robbing a nuance and vague propaganda is stripping people of their individuality. In the same way that real-life instances of anti-LGBTQ+ or immigrant propaganda makes it harder for people to relate to a part of themselves, it's making it harder for people with superpowers to see their gifts as being exactly that, as opposed to a burden. This feels so deliberate on the part of the movie too, which chose to pull away from following Bob and Helen after their wedding to let it all play out. Rather than give us a front row seat to the action, we're shown all of this through thinly veiled propaganda. That, followed by the cut to the present for these characters, is all it wants to offer us. There were superheroes, and now there aren't. And it's only after they get that message across that the film returns to Bob and we see how badly that's going for him. Something I found interesting about this was how it means that we also missed out on hearing what non-supers had to say on the matter, or at least the ones that weren't suing superheroes and had anything to gain from their stance. We don't ever hear anything from them on the subject, so it's left for us to interpret, but based off of how grateful everyone is to see the Incredibles band together at the end of the movie, as well as how several of them tried to figure out which superhero syndrome was supposed to be, we can infer that at least some of them might miss having them around. Oh, and there's also that kid that thinks Mr. Incredible's powers are awesome too, and Frozone's wife, who didn't seem to be particularly interested in his superheroing. Actually, while we're on the subject of them, and honestly because I didn't have anywhere else to put this, why don't we try dissecting their exchange to see if we can read anything interesting from it? For starters, she calls herself the best thing that'll ever happen to him. Not the glory of his superhero days, and not the impending opportunity to be a hero again, though she admittedly doesn't know what's happening yet. Her. The person that's trying to boss him around and say that she knows what's better for him in the process, which is more or less the same thing the government had told all of the superheroes back in the 40s. But it gets worse because, unlike the government, who at least had the courtesy to news on the march their ass, she's also off-screen, which implies that she probably doesn't even have the best view of the situation and is perhaps only looking at things from her point of view. Or that she's especially indifferent to what her husband wants because she won't even meet him face to face to tell him he can't do it. Now, to be fair, the movie doesn't actually say any of this to you because it's just a quick one-and-done comedy scene, but I don't know, it's just something I found myself thinking about, especially because we don't ever meet Frozone's wife in either of the Incredibles movies. Look, I could probably keep digging at this movie to find ways that it's deeper than meets the eye, but, like, the video's already long enough, right? This is good. The point of all of this is that revisiting The Incredibles proved to be a much better experience than I anticipated it would be. I went into this expecting a fun, family-friendly piece of entertainment that I could turn my brain off to, and I left surprised by how much depth and characterization it had. Except that I wasn't actually that surprised in hindsight because, again, Brad Bird also made The Iron Giant, a movie that I've been told features a glimpse at the person I'll become in like the next 10 or so years.
Hey!
Yeah?
You're right in the middle of the road!
Yeah?
All right.
I think that's enough fun for one day.
A comment that hurts especially bad because I literally own a copy of the Dharma Bums and already wear Wayfarers. One of the things I've always appreciated about Pixar movies, namely its earlier stuff that I'm more familiar with, was how they tended to work on multiple levels. Toy Story isn't just a visualization of what it would be like for toys to actually be alive. It's a clever meditation on purpose with what I consider to be a unique, non-romantic love triangle between Andy, Buzz, and Woody. Monsters, Inc. operates as a delightfully coherent commentary on, no pun intended, fear-mongering and climate change. And WALL-E is, well, it's WALL-E, a movie that only feels more prophetic as time goes on. While the same could be said about a lot of other Disney flicks, it's always felt especially true with Pixar's output, and The Incredibles reminded me of just how true that is. A lot of children's entertainment may slip in the odd joke or two for an older audience, but Pixar's golden age has always felt just a touch more motivated when they've done it. Stuff like DreamWorks' Shrek series may make the odd joke about unionizing, but it's ever hardly a major thread within the story itself. I wouldn't go as far as to say that one way of working is better than the other, but I do feel like I prefer movies such as The Incredibles over the Shrek 2s of the world, as much as I do love that movie, by the way, because it has a bit more depth to it. Films like The Incredibles aren't just trying to be good kids movies, or even enjoyable for kids and adults alike. They seem more interested in being good movies, period. They want to be something that has a through line and explores a theme in a unique, well thought out way. And that isn't even a condemning of movies that don't do that either, because there's a time and place for them too. It's just that the Incredibles of the world stand out from the bunch. Much like the movie tells us about these characters, they're just different and want the legroom to flaunt the unique aspects of their personalities. Because they understand that while a guy like me may not particularly care for Disney as a company or a lot of their movies, they might have something up their sleeve that I'd enjoy and gladly admit that I was wrong to overlook in the first place. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you decide to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, answer the question of the day, or just share it with a couple of people you think might really enjoy it. If you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you could also subscribe to my Patreon or sign up for a channel membership. I don't know what it's called. Enlist for a channel membership. Yeah. You could also check out my 2 podcasts, like I said earlier. Media Obscura is a show that's dedicated to old and obscure movies and television, and Glaring Admissions is a brand new show I debuted this year that's all about watching iconic, seminal classic movies that either myself or my co-host Raekwon have never seen before. They're both hosted on the same RSS feed, which can be accessed from the link in the description or on your favorite podcast player. As if that weren't enough, you could also just watch the full video edits of every new episode as they get uploaded to this channel. If you're a fan of like Red Letter Media and that kind of thing, the video episodes are more or less exactly that format. So yeah. Bye.
Thrones of screaming people, and just when all hope is lost,